Can someone mute the janitor before she starts negotiating too? Adrian Cole's voice sliced through the boardroom, sharp enough to trigger a wave of restrained laughter around the 42-foot marble table. A few executives lowered their eyes behind glowing tablets. Others smirked openly into crystal water glasses. At the far end of the room, Naomi Carter stood beside a stainless steel cleaning cart, one hand wrapped around the handle of a spray bottle, the other gripping a folded microfiber cloth still damp from lemon polish. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind her reflected the orange glow of a Manhattan sunset, painting the glass walls in streaks of gold and amber. Naomi didn't react right away. She simply lowered her eyes and continued wiping fingerprints from the edge of the conference table, as if humiliation had become another sound she'd learned to clean around. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit and leaned back into his leather chair with the relaxed confidence of a man used to controlling every room he entered. At 39 years old, he was already the face of Coal Dynamics, a billion-dollar energy company preparing to finalize the biggest international deal of the year. Across from him sat the Kenyan delegation, 3 government officials and 2 corporate advisors flown in from Nairobi less than 24 hours earlier. Their folders remained closed, their expressions unreadable. The air inside the room felt colder than the December skyline outside. Now, Adrian continued with a polished smile. Where were we before the cleaning crew joined the negotiation? Another ripple of laughter moved across the room, softer this time, nervous. Naomi's jaw tightened almost invisibly. She kept wiping the glass in slow circles, though her hands had begun to tremble beneath the yellow rubber gloves. She hated boardrooms. Hated the smell of expensive cologne mixed with burnt espresso and ego. Hated the way wealthy people spoke around workers instead of to them. But most of all, she hated microphones. Years ago, her voice had once filled conference halls in Geneva and Brussels, calm and precise, translating impossible conversations between governments that refused to trust each other. Back then, people listened when Naomi Carter spoke. Now most people barely looked at her long enough to notice the silver employee badge clipped to her Navy maintenance uniform. Adrian turned toward the delegation again. As I was saying, Coal Dynamics will maintain primary operational authority over all land development initiatives. That wording is the problem. The voice came quietly from behind him. The room froze. Adrian blinked once and slowly turned his head toward the cleaner standing beside the windows. Naomi immediately looked down, almost as if she regretted speaking at all. One of the executives let out an awkward cough. Another muttered, "Jesus Christ." Adrian smiled without warmth. "Excuse me." Naomi swallowed carefully. "The phrase operational authority," she said softly, "doesn't translate the same way in Swahili legal structure. It sounds like permanent ownership." Silence flooded the room so completely even the soft hum of the ceiling vents suddenly sounded loud. The Kenyan minister sitting nearest the center slowly removed his glasses and stared at Naomi with growing disbelief. Adrian laughed once under his breath and shook his head. "And you know this because you mop floors between law school classes?" A few people chuckled again, relieved the tension had broken. But the Kenyan minister didn't laugh. He stood slowly from his chair, eyes fixed entirely on Naomi now. "Wait," he said quietly, his accent deep and measured. "I know her." Naomi's hand tightened around the cloth. The room stopped breathing. "You're Naomi Carter," the minister whispered. "The woman from the Geneva Water Accord." Adrian's confident smile disappeared for the first time that evening. The minister's chair scraped softly against the marble floor as he stepped around the table without taking his eyes off Naomi. The executives looked at one another in growing confusion, their earlier amusement draining into silence. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly over Manhattan, turning the skyline pale beneath the fading evening light. Naomi lowered the microfiber cloth onto her cleaning cart with careful hands. She looked like she wanted the floor to open beneath her and erase the moment entirely. "It really is you," the minister said again, his voice quieter now. "Geneva. 10 years ago." Adrian's expression hardened. "Minister Odinga," he interrupted smoothly. "I think there has been some misunderstanding here. She is part of our overnight facilities staff." Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose. The scent of lemon cleaner mixed with roasted coffee lingered heavily in the room. "That may be true tonight," Odinga replied without looking away from her. But once upon a time, she negotiated water rights between three governments that were days away from collapsing into economic disaster. The room went still again. One of the junior executives nervously adjusted his tie. Another quietly closed his laptop. Adrian stared at Naomi as though seeing her face for the first time. She looked nothing like the polished diplomats he had spent his career around. Her navy uniform sleeves were rolled to her elbows. A few strands of dark hair had escaped the knot at the back of her neck. Her yellow gloves were faded from chemicals and long shifts. Yet somehow none of that mattered now. "You worked in Geneva?" one of the attorneys asked quietly. Naomi hesitated before answering. "A long time ago." Her voice remained soft, but no longer uncertain. Adrian leaned forward slowly, fingers pressed together on the table. "You expect everyone in this room to believe that a woman cleaning glass windows at $10 an hour used to negotiate international treaties?" Naomi finally looked up at him directly. There was no anger in her expression. That was what unsettled him most. $12.50, she corrected gently. A stunned laugh escaped someone near the end of the table before dying almost immediately. Odinga shook his head in disbelief. "You disappeared after the accord," he said. "People said you left diplomacy completely." Naomi's eyes drifted toward the snow outside. For a brief moment, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass like distant stars. "My son got sick," she answered quietly. "Congenital heart disease. For surgeries before he turned 8. Nobody spoke. Even Adrian's posture shifted. Slightly. Naomi continued, wiping a faint water ring from the table as she spoke, almost as though the movement helped her keep breathing steadily. "Insurance disappeared after I left my position. Medical debt followed everything else. Eventually, titles stopped matching when hospital bills start arriving every month." The words landed heavily in the room. Not dramatic, not angry, just true. Odinga's face softened with visible regret. "You should have called someone." Naomi offered a faint smile that did not fully reach her eyes. "People stop answering when your name disappears from headlines." Adrian looked down briefly at the contract spread before him. The clause Naomi mentioned earlier suddenly felt heavier now, dangerous in ways he had failed to notice. He hated that feeling, hated uncertainty, hated losing control of a room. "Even if what you are saying is true," he said carefully, "this negotiation is still being handled by my legal department." Naomi nodded once. "Then your legal department should know that in Kenyan land law, operational authority over tribal regions can legally translate into permanent extraction control." A pulse of tension moved across the delegation instantly. One advisor whispered something urgently under his breath. Odinga's expression darkened. Adrian noticed it immediately, and for the first time that night, cold unease crept slowly into his chest. The silence inside the boardroom stretched so long that the faint ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded enormous. Adrian slowly loosened his grip on the leather chair arm beneath his hand. Across the table, the Kenyan advisors had stopped reading the contract altogether. One of them leaned toward Minister Odinga, whispering rapidly in Swahili while pointing at paragraph 14 of the agreement. Naomi remained beside her cleaning cart, shoulders squared but calm, as though she had already accepted whatever humiliation might come next. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished marble floor around her shoes. Adrian finally stood. "All right," he said carefully, forcing confidence back into his voice. "Let us not turn this meeting into theater." He straightened the front of his suit jacket and walked toward the digital screen mounted along the wall. "Our legal team spent 6 months preparing this contract with full compliance review." Naomi did not move. "I believe that," she answered quietly. "But the wording still creates a dangerous interpretation under regional land protections." Adrian exhaled through his nose. "You are basing this on what exactly?" Naomi looked toward the contract again. "A translation issue." One of the attorneys scoffed softly. "A translation issue does not destroy a $400 million energy agreement." Naomi's eyes lifted toward him. "Actually, that is usually exactly what destroys them." The room fell quiet again. Minister Odinga slowly nodded once, almost unwillingly. Adrian noticed it immediately. The feeling in his chest tightened further. He hated losing momentum during negotiations. Investors hated uncertainty. Markets hated delays. And tonight's deal was supposed to secure coal dynamics for the next decade. Snow drifted steadily outside now, soft flakes brushing against the glass windows 42 stories above Manhattan traffic. The city lights below blurred into streaks of white and amber through the storm. Naomi removed one glove carefully, finger by finger, then stepped closer to the table. Nobody stopped her this time. She reached for the contract gently, like someone touching an old scar. "This sentence here," she said softly, pointing toward a highlighted clause, uses the phrase permanent operational stewardship over designated development regions. Adrian crossed his arms. "Correct." Naomi glanced toward the Kenyan delegation. But in several East African legal systems, stewardship over tribal land historically implies generational authority. One advisor immediately sat upright. Another removed his glasses with visible concern. Naomi continued, "To your lawyers, it sounds temporary. To their parliament, it could sound like foreign land acquisition." Adrian's confidence slipped almost invisibly. He looked toward his legal team. Nobody answered right away. Finally, one attorney cleared his throat. "That interpretation would be unlikely." "Unlikely is not impossible," Naomi replied. "And if local media frames this as an American corporation taking protected land rights, the backlash will destroy public trust before construction even begins." Odinga slowly closed the contract folder in front of him. The sound echoed heavily across the marble table. Adrian felt the room shift against him. Just 1 hour earlier, he had controlled every inch of this negotiation. Now every executive in the room kept glancing toward the cleaner standing beside the conference table with one bare hand and tired eyes. Naomi stepped back slightly, as though already regretting speaking so much. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I should not have interrupted." Adrian studied her face carefully for the first time without arrogance clouding his view. She looked exhausted. Not weak. Exhausted. There was a difference he had never bothered learning before. Odinga leaned forward slowly. "No," the minister said. "You absolutely should have." The words settled into the room like falling stone. Naomi lowered her gaze again. But Adrian noticed something now that unsettled him even more than the contract problem itself. The Kenyan delegation trusted her more than they trusted him. Adrian slowly walked back toward his chair, but the confidence in his stride was gone now, replaced by the careful restraint of a man realizing the room had shifted beneath him. The lights above the conference table reflected sharply against the dark glass walls, turning everyone's faces pale beneath the winter glow outside. Snow continued drifting across Manhattan in slow, silent waves. Naomi stepped away from the table and instinctively reached for the handle of her cleaning cardigan, almost like she wanted to disappear back into invisibility before anyone asked another question. But Minister Odinga spoke first. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "if you were leading this negotiation, how would you fix the language?" Every head in the room turned toward her again. Naomi froze. Adrian noticed it immediately. The same woman who had calmly dismantled a legal disaster seconds earlier suddenly looked uncertain, almost cornered. Her fingers tightened around the spray bottle in her cart. "Sir," she answered carefully, "I am not part of this company." "No," Odinga replied. "But you understand what my government fears." A heavy silence followed. One of Adrian's board members leaned toward him and whispered, "This is getting dangerous." Adrian did not answer. For the first time in years, he was thinking faster than he was speaking. He looked toward Naomi again. She still stood in her maintenance uniform beneath the cold conference lights, one yellow glove removed, exhaustion visible beneath her calm expression. Yet somehow she was now the only person in the room the Kenyan delegation trusted. The realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Naomi slowly walked back toward the table. Her shoes made almost no sound against the marble floor. "The issue is not energy development," she said quietly. "It is ownership language." She gently rotated the contract toward herself and scanned the page for several seconds. The room remained completely still around her. Even the executives who mocked her earlier now watched in silence. Naomi finally pointed toward a paragraph midway down the page. "Replace permanent operational stewardship with renewable cooperative oversight under local jurisdiction." One attorney frowned immediately. "That weakens our authority." Naomi shook her head softly. "No, it changes the emotional meaning without weakening operational structure." Odinga exchanged a quick look with his advisors. Naomi continued carefully. "Right now, the contract reads like extraction. That wording makes people fear loss. But cooperative oversight sounds shared. Sustainable. Respectful. Adrian crossed his arms tighter. You think wording alone changes billion-dollar negotiations? Naomi looked at him quietly. Words are usually the first thing that destroys them. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Adrian glanced toward the delegation again. The tension in their shoulders had eased slightly for the first time all evening. One advisor even nodded faintly while rereading the clause. Naomi stepped back again after speaking, as though she had already said too much. Her breathing remained controlled, but Adrian noticed the small signs now. The faint trembling in her fingertips. The tiredness beneath her eyes. This was not confidence born from ego. It was survival. Minister Odinga slowly closed the folder once more, but this time his expression carried something closer to relief. If those revisions are made, he said carefully, I believe we may continue discussions. A pulse of surprise moved across the room. One executive quietly muttered, Unbelievable. Adrian remained silent. The deal that had been collapsing less than 20 minutes ago was stabilizing because of a woman he had publicly mocked in front of everyone. Naomi reached for her glove again, clearly preparing to leave now that the immediate crisis had passed. But before she could step away, Adrian spoke. Wait. His voice sounded different this time. Lower. Controlled. Naomi paused without turning fully toward him. Adrian looked down at the contract in front of him, then slowly back at her. Sit down, he said quietly, and help us finish this negotiation. The room went completely still again. Naomi did not move immediately. The request seemed to hang in the cold air between her and Adrian like something fragile that nobody fully trusted yet. Around the table, executives exchanged uneasy glances while the snow outside thickened against the windows in slow white currents. The city below looked distant now, blurred beneath winter fog and reflected conference lights. Naomi looked down at her maintenance uniform for a brief second, then toward the empty leather chair near the center of the table. Sir, she said carefully, I am still on the cleaning clock. A few nervous laughs slipped out around the room before dying quickly. Adrian did not smile this time. Sit down anyway. His voice remained calm, but the tension underneath it was impossible to miss. Naomi hesitated another moment before slowly removing her second glove. The faint scent of industrial cleaner lingered on her hands as she folded the gloves neatly beside the contract. Then, with visible reluctance, she sat at the same table where she had been mocked less than 30 minutes earlier. The room watched her closely, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not. Minister Odinga leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. Miss Carter, he said, what concerns would local communities still have even with revised wording? Naomi looked toward the contract again, her expression focused now in a way Adrian had never seen before. It was not performance. It was instinct returning after years buried beneath survival. Employment guarantees, she answered quietly, and environmental restoration timelines. One executive frowned. Those details are already addressed in Section 22. Naomi shook her head gently. Not clearly enough. She flipped through the contract pages with practiced precision, stopping near the back. Right here. Adrian watched her carefully now. Every movement felt controlled, measured. Nothing about her resembled the timid cleaner he thought he understood earlier that evening. Naomi tapped lightly against a paragraph with one finger. This says local labor preference when reasonably available. She glanced toward the delegation. That phrase sounds optional. Odinga nodded immediately. Exactly. Naomi continued softly. Replace it with guaranteed minimum local workforce participation at every construction phase. One of Adrian's attorneys sighed quietly. That exposes the company to staffing limitations. Naomi met his eyes calmly. No. It creates trust before the first machine even touches the ground. Silence settled again. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face while the rest of the room reviewed the revisions she suggested. The strange part was not that she understood negotiations. It was how naturally she navigated people. She spoke like someone who understood fear before contracts, pride before numbers, human reaction before legal language. That realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Naomi continued reviewing clauses for another 20 minutes, adjusting wording that softened power without weakening structure. Every time she spoke, the tension across the Kenyan delegation eased further. Even the attorneys who initially resisted her had stopped interrupting. At some point, the coffee in the room had gone cold. The overhead lights dimmed automatically as the evening deepened outside. Finally, Odinga closed the revised folder slowly and exhaled. "This," he said quietly, "is the first version of this agreement that feels like partnership instead of extraction." The words landed heavily across the boardroom. Adrian glanced toward Naomi instinctively. She looked exhausted now. Tiny shadows sat beneath her eyes. Her shoulders had lowered slightly with fatigue, but her voice never lost steadiness. One of the assistants entered quietly to refill water glasses, then paused in visible confusion, seeing Naomi seated among executives instead of standing beside her cleaning cart. Naomi noticed the reaction immediately and instinctively started gathering her gloves again. Adrian saw it too. Saw the reflex to make herself smaller before anyone else could remind her where she belonged. But before she could stand, one of the Kenyan advisors spoke softly across the table. "Miss Carter," he said, "would you stay until we finish?" Naomi looked surprised for the first time all night. Then slowly, almost cautiously, she sat back down. By the time the final revisions were completed, the city outside had disappeared behind snowfall and darkness. The boardroom windows reflected only the people inside now, tired faces floating against black glass 42 stories above Manhattan. Half-empty coffee cups sat forgotten beside legal pads and glowing tablets. The sharp energy that filled the room earlier had faded into something quieter, slower, human. Naomi leaned back slightly in the leather chair, one hand resting against the edge of the contract while the other rubbed faintly at her wrist. Hours of cleaning chemicals had left her skin dry and red beneath the conference lights. She looked out of place at the table, and yet somehow more grounded than everyone else around it. Minister Odinga reviewed the final pages carefully before placing his pen down at last. "This version," he said softly, "shows respect." Nobody answered immediately. The silence felt heavier now, not tense but reflective, like everyone was realizing they had witnessed something they did not fully understand yet. Adrian sat across from Naomi with his hands folded in front of him, watching her quietly while the attorneys organized paperwork. Earlier that evening he had laughed when she spoke. Now every executive in the room waited for her opinion before moving forward. The shift unsettled him in ways success never had. Naomi noticed the contract folder nearest her was slightly crooked and absent-mindedly straightened it against the edge of the table. The small movement struck Adrian harder than it should have. Even after everything, she still carried herself like someone trying not to inconvenience anyone. One of the assistants entered with fresh coffee and paused awkwardly beside Naomi. "Would you like one too, ma'am?" he asked softly. The words seemed to surprise everyone, including Naomi herself. She blinked once before answering. "Tea, if there is any." "Of course." The assistant hurried away almost immediately. Adrian watched the exchange in silence. Respect had entered the room, so gradually nobody noticed the exact moment it happened. Outside, snow tapped softly against the glass like distant static. Minister Odinga finally signed the revised preliminary agreement, followed by the advisors beside him. One by one, pens moved across paper beneath the low amber lights. The sound was soft but unmistakable. The deal was alive again. Adrian picked up his own pen slowly, but before signing, he looked toward Naomi. "You saved this negotiation tonight." Naomi immediately shook her head. "No, sir." Her voice remained gentle. "I only stopped people from misunderstanding each other." The simplicity of the answer left the room quiet once more. Most executives Adrian knew would have demanded recognition by now. Credit, leverage, position. Naomi asked for none of it. The assistant returned carefully, carrying a small paper cup of chamomile tea. Naomi accepted it with both hands like warmth itself had become unfamiliar. Steam curled softly upward beneath the dim lights. Adrian signed the contract without taking his eyes fully off her. The attorneys began collecting documents while the delegation stood and exchanged handshakes across the table. But Minister Odinga paused before leaving. He turned toward Naomi slowly. "The world lost something important when you disappeared from those rooms," he said. Naomi lowered her eyes into the rising steam from her tea. "The world kept moving anyway." Odinga smiled sadly. "Perhaps, but not always wisely." He extended his hand. Naomi looked startled for half a second before shaking it gently. The minister nodded once and walked toward the elevators with the rest of his delegation. Soon the room emptied piece by piece until only Adrian and Naomi remained beneath the muted conference lights. The cleaning cart still stood near the windows exactly where she left it hours earlier. Naomi looked toward it instinctively, almost embarrassed. "I should finish the floors before the overnight shift ends," she said quietly. Adrian stared at her for a long moment before answering. "After everything that happened tonight, you are still worried about the floors?" Naomi gave the faintest smile. "Tired. Honest. Bills do not stop because someone finally listens to you for one evening." The words settled deep into the silence between them. Naomi stood slowly from the conference table, carefully placing the untouched teacup beside the signed agreement. The steam had already faded. Around her, the boardroom carried the quiet exhaustion of people who had spent hours fighting invisible wars through words and signatures. Chairs sat half turned away from the table. Forgotten tablets glowed softly in sleep mode. Outside the windows, Manhattan had vanished completely beneath snowfall and midnight haze. Adrian remained seated for another moment, watching Naomi move toward the cleaning cart near the glass wall. The wheels squeaked faintly as she adjusted the handle. The sound felt strangely out of place now, almost painful after everything he had learned about her that evening. "Naomi." She paused, but did not turn fully around. Adrian stood slowly, loosening his tie for the first time all day. "How long have you worked here?" 8 months. "And nobody knew who you were?" Naomi gave a tired shrug. "People usually see the uniform first." Adrian looked down briefly. The words hit harder than they should have. Earlier that same evening, he had done exactly that. Naomi reached for the spray bottle beside the cart, but Adrian stepped closer before she could continue. "You should not be cleaning floors after saving a $400 million agreement." Naomi finally turned toward him completely. The conference lights reflected softly across her face, catching the exhaustion beneath her eyes, but also something steadier underneath it. "My son's medication costs $3,000 a month," she said quietly. "So tonight, I am whatever job pays on Friday." Adrian opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For years he had negotiated with politicians, investors, executives, people trained to speak strategically even when discussing pain. Naomi did not speak strategically. She spoke plainly, and somehow that honesty felt heavier than every polished speech he had heard in years. The silence stretched between them while snow drifted against the windows behind her. Finally, Adrian asked, "How old is your son?" Naomi's expression softened almost immediately. 11. "How is he now?" A faint smile touched her face for the first time that evening. "Small. Real. Better than doctors expected." Adrian nodded slowly. "Because of you." Naomi looked down briefly at the cleaning cart. "Because people helped when they could." The answer unsettled him again. She had every reason to carry bitterness into that room tonight. Instead, she spent hours protecting a company that had overlooked her existence. Adrian glanced toward the signed contracts still resting on the conference table. "You could have let us fail," he admitted quietly. Naomi's eyes lifted back to him. "The communities in Kenya would have paid for that failure first." Another silence followed. Softer this time. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator bell chimed faintly before disappearing into the quiet building. Adrian looked at her carefully, almost struggling to understand the kind of person standing in front of him. Success he understood. Ambition he understood. But kindness without leverage confused him. "Back in Geneva," he asked slowly, "why did you leave permanently?" Naomi rested both hands on the cart handle. "After my son's second surgery, I missed a summit in Brussels." Her voice remained calm, but Adrian noticed the tiny pause before she continued. "A man on television said emotional women should not negotiate international policy if they could not separate work from motherhood." Adrian felt shame tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Naomi gave a faint breath of laughter without humor. The funny part is he probably thought he sounded professional. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly. Earlier that same evening, he had mocked her voice in front of an entire room. The realization settled heavily over him now. Impossible to escape. Naomi gently pushed the cart forward, intending to leave. But Adrian spoke again before she reached the door. "Tomorrow morning," he said carefully, "I want you upstairs in Executive Conference Room 3. Naomi stopped. "Why?" Adrian held her gaze this time without arrogance, without performance. Because Coal Dynamics should probably stop pretending its smartest negotiator works nights with a mop. Naomi stared at him silently, while snow continued falling beyond the glass like the city itself had gone quiet to listen. Naomi barely slept that night. By the time the gray light of morning pushed through the thin curtains of her apartment in Queens, she was already awake at the kitchen table reviewing old notes inside a worn leather folder she had not opened in years. The radiator hissed softly beside her while snow drifted past the fire escape outside. Across the small apartment, her son Marcus slept quietly on the couch beneath a thick blanket, one arm wrapped around a faded basketball pillow. Naomi looked at him for a long moment before quietly closing the folder again. At 8:45 that morning, the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor of Coal Dynamics. Naomi stepped out slowly, dressed not in her maintenance uniform, but in a simple navy sweater, black slacks, and a wool coat still dusted with snowflakes from the street below. The marble hallway felt colder during daylight. Assistants moved quickly between offices carrying tablets and coffee trays, but several slowed when they recognized her. Some stared openly. Others whispered behind lowered voices. Naomi kept walking. Executive Conference Room 3 sat at the end of the hall beneath a wall of glass overlooking the East River. When she entered, conversation immediately stopped. Around the table sat senior board members, legal advisors, and department heads who had laughed at her less than 12 hours earlier. Adrian stood near the windows with a tablet in one hand. He looked like he had not slept either. For a moment, nobody spoke. Naomi noticed an empty chair waiting near the center of the table. Not at the corner. Not near the back wall. At the table itself. Adrian finally broke the silence. "Thank you for coming." Naomi nodded once, but remained standing. One board member cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Carter," he began carefully, "we reviewed the revised agreement this morning. The Kenyan delegation approved every recommendation." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. "That is good news." Another executive leaned forward. "Good news?" The company's stock already jumped 6% before opening bell. The room carried a strange energy now, part admiration, part discomfort. Nobody knew how to act around the woman they had dismissed as invisible yesterday evening. Adrian set his tablet down slowly. "I asked everyone here, because there is something I need to say before we move forward." Naomi looked up. Adrian met her eyes directly, and for the first time since she had known him, there was no performance in his expression. No polished executive mask, just honesty stripped bare. "Last night," he said quietly, "I mocked your voice in front of this entire room." The silence that followed felt immediate and heavy. Nobody moved. Adrian continued carefully. "I assumed your position defined your value. I assumed your uniform defined your intelligence. And I was wrong." Naomi remained still beside the table. Adrian glanced briefly around the room before looking back at her again. "The truth is, everyone in this company heard you speaking before I ever listened." The words settled deeply across the conference room. One of the older attorneys lowered his eyes. Another executive slowly removed her glasses as though ashamed to meet Naomi's gaze. Adrian stepped closer to the table. "Coal Dynamics would like to formally offer you a position leading international cultural negotiations and community relations." A folder rested waiting in front of the empty chair now. Naomi stared at it silently. "The salary includes full medical coverage for your son," Adrian added softly. Naomi's breathing caught almost invisibly. The room remained completely still around her. Snowlight reflected across the windows behind Adrian, pale and clean against the winter skyline. Naomi looked down at the folder, but did not reach for it immediately. "Why?" she asked quietly. Adrian's answer came without hesitation this time. "Because intelligence should never have needed permission to enter this room in the first place." 3 weeks later, the snow was gone from Manhattan. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of Coal Dynamics in long bands of gold, warming the marble floors that once reflected only hurried footsteps and lowered eyes. Employees moved differently now on the executive level. Slower when they passed Conference Room 3. More aware. More careful with the voices they ignored before. Inside the room, a new negotiation meeting had already begun. International advisors sat around the table reviewing infrastructure proposals, while legal teams organized translation files across glowing screens. At the center of the room sat Naomi Carter. No maintenance cart, no yellow gloves, just a navy blazer, a leather notebook, and the same calm presence that somehow quieted every room she entered. The board listened when she spoke now, not because she raised her voice, but because she never wasted words. Adrian stood near the windows reviewing final briefing notes, while morning traffic moved far below beside the East River. He glanced toward Naomi as she carefully explained community compensation protections to a European investor twice her age. The man interrupted twice. Naomi never reacted emotionally. She simply adjusted the language until resistance softened into understanding. Adrian noticed something then that he had missed his entire life. Real authority did not humiliate people. It made them feel heard. The realization stayed with him longer than he expected. Across the room, one of the younger assistants entered carrying fresh coffee trays. He paused beside Naomi first. "Chamomile tea, ma'am." Naomi smiled softly. "Thank you, Daniel." The assistant smiled back before continuing around the room. Small moments like that had become strangely noticeable lately. People looked her in the eye now. They held doors open. They listened carefully when she spoke. Not because her intelligence suddenly appeared overnight, but because somebody important had finally acknowledged it publicly. The meeting ended an hour later with signed approvals and quiet handshakes. As executives filtered out into the hallway, Adrian remained behind gathering papers near the windows. Naomi closed her notebook slowly, rubbing faint stiffness from her wrist. The sunlight against the glass reflected softly across the room. "Marcus had another checkup yesterday," she said quietly while organizing her files. Adrian looked up immediately. "How did it go?" Naomi's expression softened into a tired but genuine smile. "The doctor said his heart is stabilizing." Adrian smiled back before he could stop himself. "That is good news." Naomi nodded once. "It is." Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment. Not awkward anymore, just quiet. Beyond the windows, the city shimmered beneath pale spring